The last couple of times we have been looking at the Constitution because of the 4th of July. Today we want to get back to a good study in prophecy. So, what I wanted to look at is we have Ezekiel 38, which talks about a war of Gog and Magog, and there's lots of speculation about it, lots of things to it. I mainly wanted to look at two things and try to go slow just to make sure once you find one thing is absolutely 100% rock solid, then you realize that you can go forward. So, a lot of people question who is Magog, who is Tarshish, who are some of the others. But the only one that no one really questions is Egypt. Egypt has always been Egypt. So let's just look at a few of those things. So we're looking at the prophecy here, and this is the prophecy of Gog and Magog, and it says, "The word of the Lord came to me, saying," and this is Ezekiel. And of course, we've had some prophecies in chapter 37 that have recently been fulfilled, and a few that have not. But this is a war that comes sometime in our near future. The word of the Lord said to me, saying, "Son of man, set your face against Gog, the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshach and Tubal, and prophesy against him, and say, Thus says the Lord, I am against thee, O Gog, chief prince of Meshach and Tubal." So there's this person named Gog, who's the chief prince of Meshach and Tubal. So Meshach and Tubal are kind of important to try to figure out, but it's specifically in the land of Magog. So we need to find out where Magog is at. So that's what we want to try to do at this point. So reading further, it says, "I will turn you back and put hooks into your jaws and bring you forth, you and all your army, horses, horsemen, all of them clothed with all sorts of armor, even a great company with bucklers and shields, all of them handling swords." Verse 5 says, "Persia, Ethiopia, and Libya with them." So Persia is pretty easy to understand. Persia was still Persia up until I think the 1930s, but today it's called Iran or Iran, however you pronounce it. But it's the country in the Middle East, Iran. And what's going to happen is there's going to be a war separate from this one between Iran and Israel. It's mentioned in Ezekiel chapter 49, and it's mentioned in the book of Enoch and a few other places. So it's an interesting war in and of itself. But Persia is Iran. And then Ethiopia today is Ethiopia and Sudan. It's the country or countries south of Egypt, basically. And there's an interesting prophecy in Isaiah about the split between Sudan and Ethiopia. And then Libya. Libya is pretty much Libya. Landmass was different, so it extended quite a bit further than it does now, but still Libya in general. And then it talks about Gomer and all of his bands. Basically, when you talk about all of his bands, you could say all of his sons. So there's a person named Gomer who conquered a land or is in charge of a land. He's got so many sons, divides the land up between the sons, and then each one is something. One of the sons of Gomer is Ashkenaz, and you've probably heard of Ashkenazic, I'm saying that right, Jews. Those are German Jews, as opposed to Sephardic Jews, which are Spanish Jews. And so that just tells us that Ashkenaz is Germany as we know it, among other things. And Gomer, of course, is the parent, so it's Germany and other things. So when it says Gomer and all of his bands, we're talking about Germany and the places connected with them. Now, some people will say, well, this is actually something different. But most of us understand this to be Germany. We're just going to look at a few of these tonight and go forward. And the house of Togarmah of the north quarters. The house of Togarmah is a certain place. It's broken up into two or three places. The house of Togarmah of the north quarters is usually considered to be Turkey. The the House of Tagarma. There's a couple of others, Armenia and a few other places. But and all of his bands, so all the ones that go with that, and many people with them, so many other small nations. And we go down and it says that this war occurs. And when it goes down here in verse 13, it says basically there's Israel, which is one side, and then there's this invasion from Magog with all of its people together. That's another side. There's this third side of people that are pro Israel, but don't really do anything about it. And I wanted to make mention of that. So it's Sheba and Dedan and the merchants of Tarshish, okay, with all the young lions thereof. So that's an interesting thing here. Now Sheba and Dedan are pretty easily identified. We're talking about the coast of Saudi Arabia. So this is Saudi Arabia in general, unless of course it breaks up in the near future. But we're talking about Saudi Arabia. The merchants of Tarshish, that's argued about because the word is believed to have started as tar and then sheesh or ish. So we're talking about the first word means tin, the last word means man. So tin man or miner of tin would be a place that has a tin mine. And back in the ancient world, we had three major tin mines. One was in Russia, which is kind of landlocked. And this is talking about the merchants of Tarshish or the shipments. And the other two are Spain and England. So there's always been this debate on whether it would be Spain or England. And we're going to see today, I think, what the scripture says about that. And then it goes on to some others. But these people, Sheba, Dedan, and Tarshish, with the groups and other nations connected with Tarshish, say, are you come to take a spoil? Talking about this Magog invasion. So they're against the invasion. They don't want it to happen, but it kind of sort of happens anyway. And they don't really move really hard to stop it, it looks like. So they're taking it. So this is basically what we want to look at tonight, just this part. So what's important about studying ancient history is finding out the names and for sure who's who. So I want, with that in mind, to look at one of the books we put together a ways back, which is Ancient Post-Flood History. It's actually the first book I wrote a long time ago. What I wanted to do is to just in general show the 16 grandsons of Noah, where they went. And so we've got a chapter on basic pre-flood, post-flood histories, the division of Europe between Ham, Shem, and Japheth, and then listing by Japheth's descendants, Ham's descendants, and Shem's descendants. So we've got chapters in here about the Anglo-Saxons with England, Armenia, Britain, Denmark, France, Germany, Georgia, Greece, Ireland, Scotland, Italy, Russia, Troy, and then Shem's descendants are the Arab nations, China, India, Iran, Iraq, Israel, the Kurds. And then we've got Ham's descendants, so the African nations in general, Canaan, Egypt, several chapters about Egypt, and then others. So mainly just a history book. But again, what's interesting is to look at the names, because if we're using old names, that's pretty important. So let's look at this first. This is the chapter 15 on Russia. Okay, so we say in here that the ancient land of Scythia is now called southern Russia. So what is now southern Russia used to be called by different names at different ages, but at one point it was called Scythia or Scythia. It's called that way depending on where you're from. This is the land that extended from the Caucasus Mountains down west as far as Kazakhstan and as far as the Ukraine. So you're just talking about basically southern Russia. And again, the borders might be a little further north or south at different time periods, but this is what we're talking about. Now, how do we get this? First, we look at Genesis chapter 10, and this is the list of nations. So King James Version, Genesis 10, verses 1 and 2, says, now these are the generations of the son of Noah, the sons of Noah. The sons of Noah, of course, are Ham, Shem, and Japheth. And unto them sons were born after the flood. The sons of Japheth were Gomer, Magog, Madai, and Javan, and Tubal, and Meshach, and Tyrus. So it's important to find out where these guys went. Now, we have to understand in the beginning, the sons are born, they're all probably relatively close to where the ark landed. And in time, they spread out and become nations. But then later on, the nations may move. So that's why it's a little tricky trying to identify who's who. So we've got Gomer. We've already said that that's Germany and several other parent states. Magog is the Scythian area, southern Russia. Madai and Javan is the Hebrew word for Greece. And then Tubal is one of the words for the group that went to Rome in that area, not necessarily the Katim, but one of the first settlers there, and in other places. At one point, we'll see that Tubal splits up, and part of it stays in Rome, Italy, what we call Rome, Italy, and part of it goes somewhere else. And then there's Meshach, and then there's Tyrus. So here's Josephus, what he says about the same passage in Antiquities of the Jews, chapter or book 1, part 6. He says, he wrote about the descendants of Magog who settled north of the Caucasus Mountains and the Black Sea, and they were called Scythians by the Greeks. So this is Josephus, Antiquities 161, says Magog founded those from him that are named Magogites. And that's just the way we translate it. Megagim would be the word in Hebrew, and in most of the time we make it ites. So I'm not sure why. One exception to that is Egyptians. They're not Egyptianites, they're Egyptians. But Magogites is what we would call them in Hebrew, he's saying here. But the same people by the Greeks are called Scythians. And that's what's really nice about looking at Josephus. He may or may not have everything right, but he will tell you this is the Hebrew starting out. This is what we call them. This is approximately where they're at. And the Greeks call them something else. And most of the time we can look at the Greek word and go, I know what we're talking about now. Now, here is another history book called The History of Britain, written by Geoffrey of Monmouth, or Geoffrey of Monmouth. It's called different things. It's an Irish historian. Actually, he's a Gaelic, one of the very few Gaelic historians that actually we still have their writings. A lot of interesting stuff about him. But basically, he mentions that Magog crowned his firstborn son, and his firstborn son was Boath. And then he was the first king of Scythia. And in time, Boath turned the kingdom over to his firstborn son, Phineas Pharsia. And it's interesting in the difference of names, and then it goes on from that. But according to his history, we have Japheth then, and we have Magog, and then we have Boath, and we have Phineas. And it's in the days of Phineas that the Tower of Babel incident occurs, and all the languages are garbled. So one of the things that Phineas does, he's one of the first to do this, is to get people to learn the other languages and create language schools. So it's really interesting to look at the history behind this. So you can't really make friends with a nation, conquer a nation, do anything unless you can first decide what they need, how you can work with them. They can't be an ally if you can't talk to them. So he was one of the first ones that did this, and there was some groups from Scotland, from what we would now call Scotland, and Egypt and things like that. So, and there's another chapter in here that gives you that type history. But so he creates a school and forms one of the first translation schools. So it's interesting here. Now, Jasher is another ancient history book, one mentioned by Scripture in two different places that we should look at it as far as history. Doesn't really have a whole lot of things that you need to know. Like the Scripture says, everything in the Scripture is all you need for a life in godliness. but sometimes these help explain the histories. So Jasher gives us the same concept of where this is at. So it's supposed to be Scythia or southern Russia. So here is Jasher chapter 10. It's the same place. It's talking about the nation states, but it just describes it a little more. Genesis will give us like children or parents and children. Jasher and some of the other texts a lot of times will give us parents, children, and grandchildren. And then when we see the subdivisions, we know for sure what group we're talking about. So Jasher says this: the children of Meshach, okay, are the Sabani, and the children of Tyrus are the Roshas. And it's interesting to me, a lot of people look at this and say, I see Russia right here as far as, the descendants of Tyre. It's actually not the name for Russia, but the Rus people. And that is the Russians, the Scandinavians, Ukrainians, that whole area are descended from these guys. The Kushini and the Ungals. And of course, you can look at this and at first take a wild guess that might be Mongolia. So some of the names are really close. So if that's Mongolia and that's the Rus or the Ukrainians, Russians, that kind of stuff, um, could be really interesting. So all of these went to build themselves cities. Those are the cities that are situated by the sea Jabus, by the river Kura or Sura, which empties itself into the river Trajan. So that should be enough to help us to understand some of this. So if you look at Ongolis as being Mongolia, the Sura River being the Sura River, the Trajan River being the Volga River, and the Jabus Sea being the Caspian Sea, which it has to be in that area, it has to be Caspian or something. There's only two or three possible seas that are landlocked, and then there's the ocean. And then the Miat, which would be the one if you go farthest north, there's a great amount of water and it's frozen up there. So that would be the Arctic Ocean. So it's really interesting to see this. So Jubilees chapter 9 gives us the similar type things. It says Magog dwells in the inner portions of the north, so from Scythia on up, that whole area, until it reaches the Sea of Miat, which could be considered, again, the Arctic Ocean. Now, what's interesting is Moscow, the capital of Russia today, actually sits on the Moskva River, which empties itself into the Volga or the Trajan River. And it should be noted that some of the sons of Meshach and Tubal also settled in areas of Greece and Italy. So again, your great grandkids might pick up and move who knows where. That's kind of important to look. So there's some Tubalites here, some over there, and that's why we want to look real careful. Sometimes people will say, well, the Magog invasion, the Magogites are not Russians, they're actually from Turkey. Well, that's because some of the same people went to Turkey or in that area. So you'd have to figure out which ones we're talking about. Okay. So Jasher goes on and talks about the sons of Magog. This is kind of important. This is not in scripture, but a little bit more detail. The sons of Magog were Elkanah and Lubal. Now, Lubal's not the same as Jubal or Tubal here, but it's a different group. But that helps us to understand. When you have a group like Scythia, as it expands, you can go back in the area and see if you can find place names of rivers, people, towns that might match these. And the more of them you get, the more for sure you're talking about this area. And then here's what Jasher says along the same lines. The sons of Tubal were Arphni, Kiesed, and Tari. The sons of Meshach were Didon, Zaron, and Shabashni. I don't know if I'm pronouncing those right, but anyway. The sons of Tiras were Benib, Gera, Luprion, and Gilak. So these are, again, place names, not so much important to us, but some of these can be identified because we just read up front that they went and created cities, based on their names, their grandkids' names. That's kind of common. Some of them would be based on that. and they're in the area of these certain rivers and certain oceans or lakes. So this is enough to point the Russian, southern Russia, as being Scythia, which we're being told by multiple people about it being the Gog and Magog area, or the land of Magog. So let's see here. And then the rest of this talks about some of the prophecies in here. So that's kind of important. So what I'm trying to demonstrate here is when we look at Jasher, Josephus, based on Genesis, and then a few of the other things, we have enough information to identify Magog, or the land of Magog. And then some of the children of Meshach were the same. So for a second, if we go back to our text here, it starts off by saying, set your face against Gog, the land of Magog, Scythia, southern Russia, the chief prince of, or ruler of, Meshach and Tubal. So again, some people get confused because some of the descendants of Meshach and Tubal went to Greece and went to Rome. But as we see throughout Scripture, Rome is considered Kittim, Rome and Cyprus. So the Roman Empire was the ships of Kittim that came. And the main part of Greece was settled by Javan. It's still the Hebrew name today. And then another subgroup of related to Javan. So these are different people. So some of them went and joined those groups, but the main places of these things are up around the Caspian Sea. So if you're talking about the chief prince of Meshach and Tubal that are in the land of Magog, we're talking about southern Russia. So very, very important. So with that, I want to go and look at one other thing here. And if we go to chapter 8 of this book, there we go. This is talking about Britain. Now, we've got a lot of interesting things. Most of the Scandinavian countries, so that would be not so much Britain, because we're going to look at something else here, but Angles, Saxons, Danish, Norwegian, just the Scandinavian peoples. They all have what's called chronicles, or most of them have chronicles. A chronicle is the very, very first or oldest type of history. So if the Bible is true, for instance, and I have a chronicle that says Adam had, Seth had, all the way down, and then we break off somewhere, and this long list of people happens to be my great great grandfather, and he settled Kansas, or United States or wherever. That would be our chronicle, because it shows we started here. There wasn't anybody before Adam, so we started here. We go down the list everybody's familiar with. We branch off this way, and these are my people up here. And then usually there's a story of how we got here. Why did we get up here? Well, there was a war, back when we were part of this group, and we branched off and went independent, came up here, and here's our story of how we ended up settling here. So that's a chronicle. And it's interesting, half the countries have those and half of them do not. They're not looked at much these days, because a lot of people will say if it has anything to do about going back to a guy in a boat and a flood or something like that, then it's got to be a Christian fiction that was tacked on to these nations in the Middle Ages. And that's the constant thing. So what's interesting is there really is no prehistory. We have history going back to Adam, or to Noah anyway. And that's pretty straightforward. If you don't like that, and you're going to say this is fiction, and you get rid of it, of course, there's no other history other than what happened. So if you're going to get rid of the history books, then we have prehistory. And it's just funny to see all these things and people going, well, we have no clue when it was or who it was. So in this case, this is documented very well, and each one of these we can see in Britain, the Angles, the Saxons, the Danish and stuff all have the same basic chronicle. And this is kind of interesting, without going into a whole lot here. It basically has the chronicle of the lineage down to their group or whoever's doing this. So in this case, for the British are kind of an interesting group. The British were one of the first to come into what we call England or Britain. Anciently, it was called Avalon. We remember some of those stories from history. But first, there were two different groups that came in to colonize. They were wiped out in plagues. And then later on, a guy named Brutus, which is where we get Britain from, came in and colonized and started the area. Today, then, when the Angles came in and the Saxons and then all the other groups finally forming what we call England today, or it used to be Angleland, when all this happened, they were kind of pushed down to the south and they became what we call Welsh. So the Welsh people are the British people. But here's the basic chronicle from that group of people. First, it starts off with this guy named Noah, who came, made it through a flood. Okay. He had a son named Japheth. Okay. Japheth had a son named Javan, who had a son Elisha. And so these are the Greek peoples, okay, at this point. And then he has number 5 there, Dardanus. Interesting history of Dardanus. And then he has a guy named Troas. And you can figure out that either Dardanus or somebody, probably Dardanus, actually created a city, named it after his son. This is the city of Troy that we hear about. And then there's another person in the archives, but we're not sure what the name was. And then this guy, and then number 9 is a guy named Aeneas, and he's mentioned in several Greek poems or history poems. So Aeneas was one of the last Trojan warriors after the Trojan War, and he made it out, managed to go down south and create an empire for himself, founded what we call Carthage on the northern African front. So he does this. Aeneas is mentioned a lot in Jasher because his time period corresponds with the children of Israel being rulers in Egypt before the slavery began. So it's an interesting thing. Anyway, he has a son, Ashkanus, and then Sylvanus, and then Brutus. So Brutus is a great grandson, or a great grandson rather, of Aeneas, 4 generations down. The history is interesting because Brutus, because of them being Trojans and the war situation, his group was actually enslaved. So there was a slavery. Brutus led an uprising, a rebellion, and managed to get independence, steal some ships, however that goes. And he sails out of Greece around the Pillars of Hercules, which is Spain, and goes up and settles into Britain, what we call Britain. He eventually colonizes the area, creates a major city like the capital, and calls it New Troy. Later on, it's renamed to London, and that's London, England. So, interesting history behind all this. And it's interesting, a lot of this comes from, like I said, Geoffrey of Monmouth, and then Ninus and a few other guys. But uh, Geoffrey of Monmouth is interesting because it used to be, up until 150 years ago, or not even that, actually, it was required reading in English history. This is the history of everything. And there was an interesting thing that happened. Um, Geoffrey actually says he got all this history from a Welsh, which would be the British records. He translates it into Latin, so that's why we have it in a good Latin form. Well, that's a nice story, but there are no Welsh versions of it. So everybody started saying, well, he probably just made it up. It does sound awfully Christian. They used to do that a lot with a lot of things. And we consistently, through archaeology, now find evidence of things exactly like we were originally told. Anyway, so they took this out of the British or the English history. They don't teach it anymore. What was interesting is later on through archaeology, not one, but I think it was 2 or 3 at least, copies of this in Welsh were discovered. And it was Sir Flanders Petrie, the Egyptologist, that did a lot of interesting things in Egypt. Um, he was British, and he actually tried to get this history reinstated as required reading in England and was turned down. It's an interesting story. But anyway, So this is a basic story of the British, and we've got England and all the other stuff here. But when I mention this simply to say, here's the Chronicle and the stuff from Jasher here, and then the story I just told you about um, Brutus and everything. And I mention this because when we get down here, um, so the ancient name for this island was called Albion, of course, and then Britain, and then now England. And the Hebrew version for this is Tarshish. And so again, we have that. There's a debate on whether it be Spain and or Britain. But I want to. I thought I had this in here. Okay, I don't have that in here anyway. Real quick here. Here's Denmark and Norway. Several quotes from old chronicles, and we have the same kind of stuff. One, two, three, four, five, six different chronicles from subgroups that have the same basic people in them. It's interesting that if you start with Noah, you get all the way down to Woden or Odin, is apparently somebody that pulled all the city states together and kind of tried to form an empire, and then Danish. So it's really interesting to see all of that. I didn't bring this up, but I want to share you. Um, I forgot to bring it up, so let's see here. The I'll just do this one real quick here and see if I can do that. And this is, bring it over here and see if we can expand it and then go down with it a little bit anyway. Okay. Forgive me for not having this up, but basically this is ancient prophecies revealed. And so with that background, we're going to look at Britain for just a second. And there's a prophecy that helps us determine whether Tarshish is England or Spain. And so at this point, if we go to um, the events for modern Israel, we will see, let's see here, the Balfour Declaration, which is the one we're looking for. Let me just go down and see it here real quick. There we go. And let me run this up so we can see it a little easier. Okay, so here's a prophecy that we want to look at. And this is actually from Isaiah chapter 60, verse 9. And this is off a little bit. Let me make sure I get this in so you can see it. That looks better. Okay, the British ships are supposed to be the first to bring the Jewish people home. This would be for the second return. So the prophets predicted a second return would begin with Great Britain, bringing the Jewish people back to their homeland by ship. And we understand this. We had World War One, without getting into all the history to that. World War One ended, the Ottoman Empire was destroyed, and then the land was carved back up, and these individual states or countries were put back pretty much like they were supposed to be. Uh, During that time, England, for whatever reason, was given the mandate for the Middle East, and other countries were given mandates for other places. So that being the case, it was Lord Balfour, that actually commissioned to create a country for the Jews, and this was known as the Balfour Declaration. And here is a prophecy in Isaiah, verse 60, or chapter 60, verse 1. It says, "Surely the coastlands will wait for me, and the ships of Tarshish," whoever Tarshish is, "will come first to bring your sons from afar, their silver and their gold with them, for the name of the Lord your God." And so this is the history here of what happened with the Ottoman Empire and everything, and General Allenby, and then here's Lord Balfour. Anyway, so here is part of the decree that he gave. This is called the Balfour Declaration, talking about England. His Majesty's government views with favor the establishment in Palestine of a home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done with any prejudice to the civil and religious rights of the existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights of political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. I would be grateful if you would bring this declaration to the knowledge of the Zionist Federation. So back in the 1800s, we already had a Zionist Federation led by Theodor Herzl in the beginning, who wanted to basically go home, create Israel again, and have the Jews be able to go home. And so, with the end of World War One, England was given the authority to carve it up however they saw fit, and had the Balfour Declaration of creating a homeland for the Jews. So they were the ones to start taking this. So if you look at this here, we go back to Isaiah chapter 60, verse 9. The coastlands will wait for me, the ships of Tarshish will come first, bringing your sons from afar. So again, if we're talking about Russia, Spain, or England, which one of those three after World War One started bringing the Jewish people to Israel and created a mandate or a declaration with the intent to create the new state of Israel? And that was the English. So it wasn't the Spanish or the Russians. So this tells us that Tarshish that we're looking at actually is England. And that's very, very important. So let me exit out of this and this one also. Oh, and then I wanted to show you here. Here is an old picture for Scythia. So this is, you can see here's Arabia and the seas. And this is today basically southern Russia. And then, of course, over here is Ukraine and some of the other small city states. Again, all of these people are connected with the Rus. So, but this is southern Russia. So let me bring this back up and we'll just kind of finish by looking at this again. So the word of the Lord came to me saying, Son of man, set your face against Gog in the land of Magog, or Scythia, southern Russia, the chief prince of Meshach and Tubal, not the groups that went to Greece and Italy, but the ones that stayed there in the area of Magog. So again, we're talking about southern Russia. Okay. And say to them, Thus says the Lord, I am against thee, O Gog, who apparently is the chief prince of the peoples of Meshach and Tubal in the land of Magog. And then this war occurs. And we've already said that Persia is Iran, Libya is Libya, and Ethiopia is Sudan and Ethiopia. And again, there's some debate on these, but we won't touch on those at the moment. And then they come with it. And then in this verse, it's Gomer and all of his bands. We didn't really look at that in depth, but Gomer is the parent group of Ashkenaz and several others. We just briefly touched on that. So the Ashkenazic Jews are the German Jews. So Germany basically and all the bands. So like East and West Germany, Austria, that area basically. I remember my professor back in college talking about how he had wished that he stood up and had the guts to say, because of this verse right here, Gomer and all of his bands in that future war means that East and West Russia has to come back together, period. It will happen. And he said he believed that because of this, but he never taught on it because everybody was saying, that'll never happen. East and West Germany, no. It's two world wars. They're not going to allow them to come back together again. And of course, that happened in the 80s. Anyway, House Togarma and many bands, many people with them. So with this, if we go down here, again, Sheba and Dedan are Saudi Arabia. But notice what it says in verse 13. It says that it's the merchants of Tarshish, merchants or ships. So we're talking about the same group again. According to Isaiah 60 and the Balfour Declaration and basic history, and the way we look at Jasher, Josephus, and the others, Tarshish would be England, not Spain or Russia or somewhere else. So Tarshish is England. So in this case, Sheba Dedan, Saudi Arabia, and then England with the young lions thereof will come and say, Have you come to take a spoil? And this is interesting because a lot of people will look at this and say, well, who are the young lions? Well, somewhere along the line, England had or created countries that are now independent. So that'd be Canada, United States, possibly even parts of Mexico, South Africa, India, just all over. They're the cubs or the states that came from um, England. Okay. But what's interesting and most people don't understand is this phrase, it could be either way, but this phrase can mean the young lions thereof, not that all of the lions that have ever come from them. So from India all the way over here, the entire world is against Russia at this point. We're talking about a certain group of cubs that banded together to form a nation. So we're not talking about Mexico, Canada, South Africa, or even India. We're talking about 13 colonies that banded together to form a nation. So the cubs of Tarshish is the United States. And so that's very important. And we have consistently been on Israel's side and been anti Russia for a long, long time. Now, when we're reading this, though, we see that Saudi Arabia, England, and the United States, and others with them, are against Russia. And they say, have you come to take a spoil? Basically, don't do this. But they don't seem to really do anything. So right now, if um, Russia was to invade the Israel, the United States would come to its aid, and that's a counterpoint. If there's ever a situation, and apparently there is one, that develops where the United States turns its back on Israel, then that would happen. Of course, now I can think of several things that would happen. If there was a pre-trib rapture, say tonight, there would be no Christians left in the government ruling or anything in the United States, at which case, why would they? So, I mean, that's not necessarily what's going to happen, but there's lots of different ideas on that. So, I wanted to kind of make mention of this. So, this is a start on this particular passage. And all we've done here is look at the histories. And I think we're pretty well understanding that the land of Magog, the people that come down, are the Russians, southern Russia. And it may have people groups with them because it says many nations. So we could have some of the Tubalites and Meshekites that went to Greece or whatever, if Greece is with them, but it doesn't look like that. It all depends on politics at the time. But the main instigator is Russia. And the major person not liking it but won't do anything is England, Tarshish. So we've identified Tarshish and Magog. And that's really all we've done, Tarshish and Magog. And to understand these prophecies, just that is a major step forward. If we can say absolutely for sure, you don't need to worry about it anymore. Magog is not Turkey, it's Russia. And we don't have to worry about Tarshish being Spain or somebody else. It was England. Well, in that case, what does England and Russia do at this point? It's a very interesting story. We can actually go on and look at some of these other things. So we'll stop there for tonight. I want to kind of start looking at some of these things. And again, just taking it a little piece at a time so we can slowly go through and make sure we know. When we try to do everything at once, it gets garbled and then everybody gets confused. I confuse myself when I do that. So we'll go ahead and stop there for tonight. Okay, they changed my things around. Okay, so now I'm going to go in the chat room and we're just going to look at questions, see what kind of questions we have. Okay, first one. Your thoughts. Tarshish in Spain is actually a city, so it wouldn't have young cubs, but England has a commonwealth in the USA, so England makes more sense to me. Yeah, I would totally agree with that. And again, the main reason, I mean, I can see it both ways, and it looks like that's pretty good evidence. But my main reasoning is the prophecy that Tarshish, and assuming that is an assumption on my part, I suppose, that Tarshish is Tarshish. There's not two or three of them. But if Tarshish is Tarshish, It's the one that brought the Israelites back at the beginning to form their second return. And if you connect that with the Balfour Declaration, it's a done deal. I mean, Tarshish is England. There's no way around that one. And of course, again, the Commonwealth. And that's an interesting point, because sometimes you have even an identical word that is a city and not a country. Now, I made the same mistake. We'll probably talk about it in the future. There's a section in Gad that lists Germany. I think it's Germany, Spain, Russia, something else, and all these countries. And then it mentions um, I forget the name now. Anyway, it's Sarafan, Lebanon. There's another prophecy specifically about that city and a war that happens in the near future. That's in like Zephaniah and Obadiah. So I was familiar with that prophecy, and I was looking at this thing, and it's like I even put it in the notes. It's like, why do we have country, 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 and then a city? It's kind of odd. And then I just went on with it, and then I my mind glitched or something. Later on, someone said, oh, maybe you don't know this, but that's the name of a city up north in Lebanon, but it's also the modern Hebrew name for France. And I'm thinking, oh, okay, that makes more sense. If they're all countries, that would make a little more sense. We're going to talk about France and the possibility of this situation going on now, or just France in general. Uh, in Bible prophecy. There's really only one text, so that's the one I was talking about. We'll probably look at that next week. But it is interesting to see all those kind of things. So yeah, I would agree with you on that. Second question is, what is the name of the Kura River that is the one in Azerbaijan? I'm not sure exactly. And that would be interesting to look at. And it's always good to do that just to see, because if you've got two or three rivers or land masses that have very similar names, it's really really good to see. One of the places in Jasher actually talks about France, and it talks about, again, not in a prophetic form, but which one of the kids founded France, and it talks about being on the Sinai River that empties past the Pillar of Hercules, and it's these group, and they were originally called Franza, and stuff like that. So there's just a whole bunch of things, and you pull them all together. It's actually the Seine River that Paris is on, and that's France. And so the words are very similar. One or two of them could be a coincidence, but when you get a ton of them, and there's actually rivers and seas and stuff that fit together, it's probably a pretty safe bet. And that's actually, remember what we're doing. I'm not saying I can guarantee this absolutely, because I'm not 2,000 years old, or 4,000 years old. I wasn't there. But the best we can do is take a guess on what we think the scripture says, and then go back and look at other texts from way back when and see if there's a consensus. And if we use Josephus, Jasher, some of the other texts, and that's actually what I did in ancient post-flood history. I used the Bible, Jasher, Josephus, Seder Olam, a few things like that, ancient Jewish texts that tell me these guys should be over here. And then if we go over there and start looking for chronicles or other stories, and maybe there's two or three stories, but one of them matches the Hebrew chronicle, then we have something. And so that's what we try to do with that one. But that's a good question. I'm not sure exactly of that one. Next question is, three large English Commonwealth countries still today are Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, and smaller islands. USA can very well be a part of the Cubs. Yeah, I believe so too. Again, you could look at it different ways, that it's the Cubs in general, which could be any of those. And obviously, in the United over here, if you just look at it, the power that is somehow still England. England still is a major power, even though it's very small. As far as like if you were to invade England, the amount of troops that it has, or actually soldiers, compared to like China, Russia, or some other places, actually not very big. But they have nuclear weapons, etc. So they are a power to be reckoned with. But then out of all of that, the United States has an incredibly large amount of soldiers, plus nuclear weapons, plus everything else. So um, the United States is definitely in there somewhere. Unless, of course, you think the United States has been destroyed, but then you're wondering why, that would be stated that way. But in this case, though, another way of looking at it is it's not all of the cubs, but it's a group of the cubs. So if there's United States and Canada and South Africa and New Zealand and Australia, maybe some of them, like I don't know the history of Australia, for instance. Maybe Australia started out as 3 or 4 separate colonies or states and then broke away from Britain. Don't know if that's the case or not, but you might have 2 or 3 different places like that. But again, the United States definitely fits as being 13 cubs that banded together to form a nation, and it happens to be a nation that's pretty much anti-Russia. So it's interesting to look at. And there's a lot of study that we need to do on Russia and the empire, the revival of the Roman Empire, how Russia may fit into that. It's really important to look and see what's going on with these. Okay, last question we have. Do you think Paul set his sights on England or Spain in his desire to spread the gospel out at the toward the end of his life? Yeah, actually, there's some different records. Even some of the church fathers. There's 2 or 3 church father records that talk about his last missionary journey. And basically, we get all the way up to Acts 28, and the book of Acts ends um, with him being in his own rented house, basically for 2 years, uh, appealing to Caesar. He's not going to run off because this is his chance to prove his court battle. So they don't worry about him running off, but they have that. He is acquitted of all charges. And you can look at this and like Eusebius, father of church history, and there's several other church fathers that'll mention that. But Paul is acquitted of all charges, and then he leaves to go on his last missionary journey. Now, the last missionary journey is not recorded in Acts, according to Eusebius says it's simply because Luke isn't with him. Luke is the one that wrote Acts, and he wrote everything what he'd heard in the beginning, and then his eyewitness accounts of Paul throughout the whole thing. And then when they went their separate ways, he basically stopped writing. So what Paul did after Luke wasn't with him anymore, Luke didn't write about. So that's why we only have 28 chapters of the history of the apostles. But basically, several church fathers mention at that point he does set sail for Spain. He preaches in Spain. He goes up and preaches in Britain. And then he comes back through Gaul, which is France, and then makes his way over to, I want to say, Neapolis. I think that's the one. And then when he's there, he gets in trouble again and he's arrested for the second time. And all that's recorded. Well, his second arrest, rather, is recorded by Eusebius. Uh, but anyway, he mentions that in Second Timothy is what he writes right before he's executed, and Eusebius and several of the guys pull out pieces of Second Timothy to prove that this was his second time in Rome, where he was being tried a second time. First time, the Caesar just said it's a wacky, weird little cult. It's not a big deal. We have bigger fish to fry, so just get rid of all the Christians. Just let them go. We're busy. And then after that, with the war with Britain, the Silurian kingdom, uh, the Silurian kingdom was probably the very first Christian nation. And so, since Rome was at war with Britain, or Siluria, and Rome is pagan, they're Christian, that means Christians per se are treasonous for political reasons. And that kind of started a bunch of stuff. And that's in the time of Nero. Nero took it and ran with it. And we have all those things. So there's actually quite a bit of history because of that. So run that down basically. Yes, Paul was released from prison at the end of Acts, went to Spain, went to Britain, went to France, Gaul, and then back to Neapolis, got rearrested, got taken back to Rome, and then was executed. So, according to the church fathers, Paul was executed in June of 67 AD. And when he was in Rome the first time, I think he was released in like 63, something like that. So, so it's like 4 or 5 years, 4.5 years in between the two trials. So, good question. A lot of interesting things. Again, it doesn't really make any difference, but because there's no prophecies connected with it or anything. But it's interesting just to see that kind of stuff. And when Eusebius brings out, hey, look very carefully at the wording in Second Timothy, and you'll see that this is the second time. So it's pretty interesting. A couple more questions popped out. Genesis 6, 7, and 8 give an account of the flood, giving the start of the month of the flood and the month Noah left the ark. What calendar was Noah using? It would be the Dead Sea Scroll calendar. So it's not the one, the first month then would be Nisan in the spring, not Tishrei in the fall. So when I originally put together my translation of Jubilees, it was explaining, the cardinal points and what they represented. And it was interesting because it looked like the equinoxes were correct, but the two solstices were flipped, and I couldn't figure out why. Because if this is the start of the year, why are these two flipped? And then it dawned on me after I wrote the book and published it that the whole thing is, flipped around 6 months. That means the equinoxes are still fine, but these two are flipped. And it's interesting to see that. Jubilees actually talks about after the flood, Noah set up the four tekufas to be a remembrance of the things that happened during the flood. And we had the anniversary of the flood is this mid spring. And again, when those flipped, it becomes mid fall. And so that's why all the traditions of Halloween, for instance, are mid fall. Halloween is an ancient memory of the day the world was destroyed. All the evil, decay, the ghouls, the dead, the zombies, that kind of stuff, all comes from that concept. And we've just really forgotten a lot of that. But yeah, it would have been the Dead Sea Scroll calendar. Same basic idea, 12 months, but instead of starting at Tishrei in the fall, it would start at Nisan in the spring. As a matter of fact, along those lines, there is a Dead Sea Scrolls are fragmented, but we do have a piece of the Dead Sea Scrolls that is Genesis parts of 6, 7, and 8 that talk all about the flood. And it's identical. There's no commentary in it per se. Like sometimes they'll quote a couple verses and give a commentary. It's just the whole text together. And it's identical with what we have, but it will come out and tell you, like for instance, the flood was on the 17th day of the second month in the 600th year of Noah's life. They will actually add a paragraph and tell you that was Sunday, whatever, first day of the week or whatever. So it's interesting. They plug their calendar in very well with that. What do you know about Acts 29? It's also called the Sassoni manuscript. It's supposedly a history of Paul's last missionary journey. And I don't know if it's been tampered with or what. There's supposed to be a prophecy in it. And I can't really interpret it per se. It depends on who we're talking about. But it talks about as long as, before the second coming, that there would be this pillar that never is taken down, and nobody seems to know where the pillar's at. Sounds like it's been taken down. So there's reason to believe that it's not a forgery. The guy that found it actually found the manuscript, and it is what it is. But that doesn't mean that it actually is a proper historical thing of what happened after Acts 28. But even if you take that and you throw it away, we have a lot of church fathers that tell us that Paul was released at the end of Acts and went to Spain, England, France, back to Neapolis, got rearrested, went to Rome, and then was executed about 4 years later, during his or after his second trial. So it's an interesting thing. I wanted to go back and look at it a couple of times um, but I can't really find anything to prove or disprove it. Maybe we will someday, but it's an interesting manuscript. And isn't it interesting how many things there are out there like that? So it's just kind of cool. Great. I was thinking that, but wasn't sure. Thanks. Do you know if Jubilees has more information on the timeline of the flood? It does, but the book of Jubilees that we have, the text, I mean, the text's not garbled, but the dates are garbled. You'll find that happens a lot of times when you translate the Hebrew into like Greek, Georgian, whatever. Somehow the numbers get garbled, and I never can figure that out. But because to say Abraham went to Egypt, it's Abraham in Egypt. It's not hard to translate. There were 500 of them. Then it was 500 of them. But somehow the numbers always get garbled. Jubilees, the one that we have is from the Ethiopic, the full version. And you'll see it starts off with Genesis at creation and it'll go down, it'll get 300 years off Genesis's account. And you might think, well, maybe, Genesis is off or something. But it gets 300 years off and then all of a sudden it turns around and starts going back. And when you get up to, I think it's the death of Jacob or one of the guys, it's actually only a year off. So you can tell somebody got off and then somebody tried to correct it. So the numbers are very different. It does have it in the proper Essene way, though, the Jubilees, the Shemitahs, and years, and things like that. What's interesting is we have 6 or 7 chapters, I mean, large sections of the chapters of Jubilees from the Dead Sea Scrolls now. And what we have, the text is identical, the stories are identical, but the numbers match Genesis perfectly. So that's pretty interesting. I would really love to get the Book of Jubilees in Hebrew form and see the rest of it. There's the Book of Jubilees, which is history. There's also supposed to be a prophecy book detailing all the problems Israel has all the way up to the Messianic kingdom. So I would love to see that myself too. So there's a lot of things like that the scrolls talk about. Yeah, it's got a little bit more information on the timeline, but as far as dates, I wouldn't trust it. Not the Ethiopic version, anyway. Maybe one day we'll have the full version. There's all these rumors, like there's supposed to be a full Aramaic translation of Enoch that was found in the scrolls. That may have been a mistake, but there's that legend floating around. And it's always possible somebody, when no one's looking, got something, sold it to a private collector. It's also possible some of those are fake. So it's just one of those things we have to kind of go with. Is the calendar going to become a contentious issue right at the end? Essene, Georgian, modern Jewish, which I think is sad to see. It might. It was a major problem back then for the Jews because if you were a Jewish priest, you're supposed to do the rituals on the right days. And if you're using the wrong calendar, you're messed up. Like you're not supposed to do, but the thing about Yom Kippur and all that kind of stuff. For us, it doesn't really matter. I mean, if Passover was next week or last week or it's today or whatever, it's in this somewhere this time this last couple of weeks. So at that point, if you're trying to say, well, maybe the Lord comes back this year on Rosh Hashanah or Pentecost or whatever, well, it's within a couple of weeks of this date then. So for us, it doesn't really matter. I'm just glad I'm not a priest trying to do rituals on the exact dates and stuff. So, and people argue that and argue it a lot. There's one text that one of the church fathers talks about before the second coming, that the believers would argue viciously about the second coming. And I see that a lot with, see, if I was to say I believe the Gog Magog invasion is Russia or whatever, and it's going to happen next week or whatever, people might look at me and go, "You're weird," or I agree or disagree. It wouldn't be a big deal. But when I come out and say I'm a pre-trib rapture guy, oh man, it's like I'm going. It's like horrible. So it's interesting to see the church fathers talk about that. For some reason, that is a major, major problem. Now, as far as chronology goes, setting dates and stuff, it might become an issue, or just having a modern Jewish calendar and a Essene calendar, comparing it with our Gregorian, might cause more people to think about setting dates, which might get some people in trouble. Um, Again, I know it says no one knows the hour of the day, and I'm not trying to set dates for the rapture or even the second coming. I have noticed dates on prophecies from other things, like 1948. They were supposed to come back on May 14th, and there was supposed to be this war where they take the Temple Mount, and that was supposed to occur on June 7th of 1967, according to the dates that were in the scriptures, actually, not even in the scrolls. And sure enough, War of 67, June 7th, 1948, May 14th, 1948. So there are some dates in there. And then we go back and we look at the death of the Messiah was supposed to be 32 AD down to the day. And I mean, there's no way to prove that was the exact year, I guess, but pretty interesting. So yeah, there might be some contentions over it. I would like to encourage all of us to study, but to, like, we're always told, well, like Jesus and Paul in the New Testament talks about the fact that we are known for our love one to the other. And if you hate your brother, you don't have eternal life abiding in you. And I could say you're very, very wrong, or I'm very, very wrong, but we need to acknowledge each other. If we're believers, we're brothers. And we don't need to argue that kind of stuff. So it's very important that we study these things. And if you and I disagree, we disagree. We'll find out as soon as the rapture happens that you're right or I'm right or whatever. At that point, it won't really matter. But it's really important to study and to learn, but not come against each other. It's very, very important. Question: what about Brit meaning covenant and Ish meaning man? Who gave this name? That's a good question. So that actually could um, possibly be that British. That's interesting. Covenant man. I don't know how that would actually, go with Brutus, or it could be a coincidence, although I don't think coincidences happen very often. But Brutus or British, I can see being that way. And covenant man definitely fits with a Brit, and then Ish. So I'm not sure who actually did that. Good question, though. It'd be something to try to trace back. It might be something really interesting to it. What does it mean that the times and the epochs will be given into his hand, meaning the Antichrist? Not sure about that one. It does talk about he seeks to change the times and the laws, which is the same thing Antiochus Epiphanes did about the calendar system. So we know what he did and the system he replaced it with and everything. So it seems like the Antichrist will try to do the same thing. It's almost like maybe the Essene calendar comes back into vogue and then he comes and attacks it again. So I don't know why that would be a thing, but and again, back then it was important because it messed up the temple rituals. He's going to stop the temple rituals in the middle of the tribulation, so it might have something to do with that. But it's an interesting question. This is cool. You guys are asking questions I have no clue on, so it'll help me go back and study. Sorry if it's off subject. Are non-Jewish Christians meant to follow the rules of the Sabbath? No, they're not. All those things are for Jews, and it's very clear in um, like Deuteronomy 14, Exodus chapter 12, things like that. We actually have a book on that called the Ancient Origins. I think it's Ancient Origins of the Hebrew Roots Movement. And you can talk to normal Calvary Chapel people, normal Hebrew, or not Hebrew Roots, Messianics, and they will all tell you. And then Orthodox Jews today also will tell you that the concept is there's basic Noahide law, which is you don't kill people, you don't steal from people, you don't fornicate, you don't, you tell you don't lie because that purges yourself in court, it messes everything up. So it's important that we follow the basic moral laws. And then the Jews had a temple with rituals that only Jews were supposed to do, specifically only some certain people from the tribe of Levi, actually. And so we're not supposed to mess with that. It's illegal. So, but like in Deuteronomy 14, I think it's 21, it talks about how a Jew can't eat non kosher food. But if he's got non kosher food, there's no sense of throwing it away. It's actually good food. So give it to the Gentile that lives next door to you. He can eat it. So things like that. And then in Exodus 12, it talks about there's one law for everybody. Everybody has to follow this law. And the law is if you're not circumcised, you do not observe the festivals. Period. I mean, you can go to someone's house and watch it. You can observe, watch the festival. There's no secret thing, but you can't participate in it. So if I was uncircumcised and I went to a Jewish person's home and they were doing Sabbath or Passover lamb, something like that, technically I'm forbidden to eat the lamb. I mean, could probably have a sandwich of something and sing songs with them or whatever, but I can't do it in my house and I'm forbidden to eat the lamb meat. Things like that. So it is pretty interesting. As a matter of fact, Jubilees actually says that the Sabbath per se was given to Israel alone, as far as the rituals on the Sabbath. Now we've always had a 7-day fest or a 7-day system, and you need to take a day of rest. So in a sense, we do a Sabbath system. We take a Saturday or a Sunday off, and then over here, I think mainly it's always Sunday. Of course, today they're trying to push people into 4 work days, 4 days off, 3 days, and not three, but it's like 4 and 4, mixing things up. So, yeah, it's for the longest time, Jews still go by a Sabbath, which is Saturday. Christians go by a Sunday service because in the ancient times, and we see this once you understand the calendar, the Sabbath service was for the public. It's just like you go and watch a play and you learn stuff and you go home. The in depth people that study prophecies and are under a rabbi, they always have a Sunday service. And when the Messiah came, they just continued the tradition that was set forth from the beginning. And that is, you go witness to people on the Sabbath in the synagogues. On Sundays, though, you come and worship and study with believers. So it's a really interesting study, but a lot of people get confused on that, and we'll talk about, that we're sinning because we're not observing the Sabbath and things like that. Is the Gospel of Nicodemus Gnostic? It might be. It's got some strange things in it, but most of those things are, depending on where you get it, there's usually like a couple of different versions, and there's usually at least one or two that's heavily Gnostic or heavily weird, and it's been edited or whatever. But there's usually one or two that's not as bad and actually might have something in it. Now we know there's only 4 gospels. There were only 4 gospels written, and the church fathers, the Ezra Apocalypse, and other things like that make it clear that the scriptures are canon and are closed, and they are what they are. That doesn't mean that somebody couldn't have written something. Like if I was there and saw part of it, I could write down what I saw and there might be something to it. But yeah, the Gospel of Nicodemus, it's been a long time since I looked at it. I need to look at it again, but it might be Gnostic, and I'm sure there's probably at least one version that is. So, okay. So we did good today. Next week, we're going to look at France and how it plays into prophecy, end time prophecy. So we'll go ahead and say good night for that, and we will see you next week. God bless you guys.